Hello, everybody. My name's Max. I'm an engineer at a company called Stytch, and today I'm going to be talking about OAuth and MCP servers. So we're going to start off with a very high-level overview of OAuth, talk a little bit about the history of the protocol and the problems that it solves. We're going to talk about how we can apply OAuth to MCP servers. And then we're going to talk a little about building MCP servers using some vendors. I really like using Cloudflare Workers for MCP. I also really like using Stytch. And then we're going to wrap it up with a demo and hopefully some time for Q&A. So first, OAuth. OAuth is a label for a collection of a large number of protocols produced by a couple of different standards organizations. IETF is the main one. There's also the OpenID Foundation. And OAuth is a pretty big space. It's been around for a while. There's actually 40 different published RFCs talking about how OAuth should work, how to use it in different contexts. And what's great about using a standard like OAuth is there are thousands of companies that have spent a lot of time making sure that OAuth solves problems in the right way. And there's tens of thousands of security researchers and engineers and pen testers that have worked on this standard and gotten it into a really good place. And when we participate in this ecosystem, we get to borrow everything that they've already built. And that's really, really powerful. So OAuth tries to solve the very high-level problem of taking user data on the internet from one place and sticking it somewhere else. And this is something we do all the time online. Login with Google is a really, really common flow, and that is something based on OAuth. You also use OAuth for connecting your Slack desktop app to a website and getting your Slack identity and all of your channels and your information on there. And you even use OAuth when you're sitting at home on the couch. When you boot up Netflix for the first time, it gives you a QR code to scan. You scan that with your phone, and then suddenly you're logged in on the TV, and the TV has access to your Netflix account. And all of this is built on the OAuth standard. So really, OAuth is about a way for a user and a service provider to work together to decide how that user's data should be shared, who it should be shared with, and what type of data they want shared. And identity is a big part of this, but identity information is just one type of data that we can share via OAuth. So there's three main pieces of terminology we need to think about when we're looking at an OAuth flow. We've got this thing called an authorization server or an identity provider. And its job is to validate that the user is who they say they are, let them log in, and then issue access tokens, which we'll get into later. And then we have a resource server. A resource server's job is to serve data. It has some cool data. You want to get that data elsewhere. But the resource server is only going to give up that data if there's an access token. And then finally, we have something called a client. And a client can be anything. A client can be an application. A client can be a website. A client can be a mobile app. A client can be all sorts of things. And this client wants to access data in the resource server, but it needs to get an access token in order to get at this data. So going back to our Netflix example, Netflix.com is going to function as the identity provider. All the Netflix servers in the clouds with the movies on them, those are going to be our resource servers. And the Netflix app on the TV, that's going to function as our client. So all of this is about something called an access token. And an access token is a really specific type of credential with some really cool properties. Access tokens are scoped to the user who granted them. And that means that when a client has an access token, the client can't do anything that the user wouldn't be able to do by themselves. The client doesn't get any extra permissions. And the user can even tamp down the permissions granted to this client by saying, I want to allow this client to do certain things, but not others. I don't want it to have all of my capabilities. So for example, I really don't want to give my TV the ability to read and edit my credit card information in Netflix. I don't see the point. I don't want to do it. But I do want to give my TV the ability to watch movies. And OAuth and access tokens gives us a framework for this kind of fine-grained access and delegation. And access tokens, I just realized I'm doing this at GitHub. Access tokens need to be used correctly. There was a really, really interesting vulnerability with the GitHub MCP server where it could use the access token in a different context. And I thought this was just such a fun, cool example of some of the new problems that come applying OAuth to LLMs and AI that still have yet to be solved. But back to the OAuth flow, general overview of how it works is an application realizes that it needs an access token in order to do something. It's going to redirect the user over to the authorization server, where the user logs in and then usually clicks a button that says, yes, I agree to share my data in this way with this party. And after the user agrees, they're redirected back with something called an authorization code. And then the client knows how to exchange this authorization code to get an access token, and then can go on and use that access token to do whatever it is that they wanted to do in the first place. And OAuth defines all of the arrows on this chart. OAuth defines the way that the application talks to the identity provider and the way that the identity provider talks back to the application. It doesn't define everything about how this should work. And there are lots of parts in the OAuth flow where people are free to implement things their own way. When it comes to logging in a user, absolutely anything can happen. You know, OAuth doesn't care if the user is logged in with a password, if they're using an SSO provider, if they have MFA configured. OAuth only is about the arrows. And this means that there's lots of things that we can add to an OAuth flow and customize to fit our needs, depending on what we want to do and what our customers want to do. So MCP and OAuth. Super quick overview. I'm not going to go super deep on MCP, but it's a way for LLMs and agents to abstract away how to access different tools and different types of data. So instead of every single LLM needing to know how to access all sorts of different APIs, MCP is supposed to be this layer in the middle, the one API to rule them all. Integrate with MCP, and you don't need to integrate with anything else. So my spicy takes about the history of authentication in MCP. The first iteration of MCP was designed to be local first and local only. And it worked really, really well at getting people excited about the protocol and into the space. But I think that it leaves a lot of people out of the ecosystem. Local MCP servers are pretty difficult for non-technical people to use. I do not think I can convince my dad to npx install something or pop open a terminal anytime soon. Similarly, a lot of the earlier MCP examples are based around API keys. And API keys and environment variables, these are tools that everybody in this room knows how to use. But that's not true of the rest of the world. And I think that if we're still depending on these tools moving forward, we're going to limit the adoption of MCP. We're going to limit the adoption of agents in AI. Could you imagine a world where we want to roll out AI tutors in a high school, and we need to give every high school student their own API key? I just don't see that going well. And the nice part about using a protocol like OAuth is everybody knows how to do it. Everybody is very familiar using it in their everyday life. So I am very, very bullish on the future of MCP being remote servers and OAuth. Mapping OAuth to MCP. MCP clients or LLMs are OAuth clients. MCP servers are OAuth resource servers. And this means that MCP servers need an authorization server. And going back to this diagram, OAuth defines the way that the MCP client and server authenticate to each other, but there's lots of other things that can happen. And the parts of this flow that aren't completely filled in are where we get to customize things. And the parts of this flow that aren't filled in are where we can take existing protocols like biometrics or SAML or SSO and map them onto the MCP structure. So how do we actually do this? I work at a place called Stytch. Stytch is a developer platform for consumer identity and access management. That means we make a bunch of APIs and SDKs that allow you to add authentication and authorization related features to your application. So we've got passwords, magic links, biometrics, all sorts of fun stuff. But what I am really excited about is we recently released UI components that can turn existing applications into authorization servers or identity providers. And so regardless of if you're using Stytch, if you're using something else, I think that most businesses out there should want to be an OAuth provider. And how it relates to MCP, if your business is an OAuth provider, if your platform is an OAuth provider, that means you can run a remote MCP server that everyone can use because you can safely issue access tokens that allow clients access to that user data. And if you run this remote MCP server, people can bring their agents. They're going to do a lot of cool things with your platform, and everyone is going to have a good time with it. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the Stytch UI components. First, we've got a nice login component. You can go and plug in different products, and you drop this on your page. And after the user goes through whatever login flow you put together, they will be logged in and authenticated, and we'll know who they are. And once we know who they are, we can ask them if they're OK sharing their data with a third-party application. And in order to become an identity provider, we put it in a React component. So import the React component, drop it on your page, and now you can issue access tokens with your user identity attached. All right, so once we issue access tokens, we need to think about verifying them. And our MCP server, being the resource server, has to verify these tokens. And this isn't too hard. Access tokens are going to come in on an HTTP header, on the bearer header. And all of the MCP clients are already going to know how to do this. And we can go and pull this access token out. And then we need to validate it. And validating an access token is pretty easy. There's something called a JWT, or a JSON Web Token. And because JWT, like OAuth, is an open standard, there's a ton of libraries and plugins and tools that help you do this. You can use the Stytch SDKs. In this example, I don't think I am. I think I'm using Jose. But you drop the token in, you drop in the private key, and it will go and give you the identity information after. And that's pretty much all you need to do to add authentication to a server using Stytch. So I'm going to do a little demo. We've got an MCP server running on Cloudflare Workers for the Stytch platform, and we're going to see if it'll work live. So I've been using this tool called Goose a whole bunch. It's a lot of fun. It's just a little guy in your terminal. And I should kick off an OAuth flow. I'm already logged in. But now we see that this access token, this identity component pops up. And I can see what data the agent wants to access in my platform. I can choose to allow this request or deny it. And I'm going to allow it because I want to give my little guy in my terminal an access token. And now we're running. Now I can ask Goose, what are my Stytch projects? And it'll go and it'll make an API call out to the MCP server. The MCP server will validate my identity, and it'll return some information that's tied to my Stytch developer account over on the normal web. Yeah. So it worked. We did a little tool execution. We got some data. And I don't really want to talk about the Stytch MCP server, although you should go check it out. I think it's pretty cool. I want to talk about how it is great that it's just so easy to add MCP to these existing APIs, to make them available to an LLM, to an AI context, so people can build really, really cool things on top. What do we have next? And then I've got a QR code up. There's a bunch of repos online where we're working with Cloudflare. And you can see how this is put together. You can fork the repo, mess around with it, and hopefully have some fun. And I think that's all of my slides. Anyone have any questions?
At a later release, what were you thinking of there? Like, what is lacking in the current system in their interactions?
Yeah, so MCP was originally, or OAuth was originally introduced in the March release of the spec, and there's been a lot of changes since then. Those changes are currently in, they call it like the draft version of what's going to go out. The main thing was really solidifying the difference between the resource server and the MCP server and the identity provider. The first hash of the spec had the resource server and the identity provider being the same identity instead of two separate things. And if you're a big enterprise, you probably already have an identity provider, and you don't really want another one. And everyone building MCP servers doesn't want to have to become an identity provider as well. It adds a lot of work to the process. So I don't know when that spec is going to make it out in the next version. I assume it's going to be sometime soon, probably in the next couple of months.
I'm curious about how to extend kind of the state of the art in fine-grained auth, and like if I wanted to issue an access token that say only gives access to complete some action, maybe swipe a credit card on my behalf up to like $100. Is that in the spec today as like a possible like conditional scope or scopes with parameters kind of thing?
Yeah. So the way in which you do this today using OAuth is you take advantage of the parts of the spec that are undefined. So that UI interaction, when the user is authorizing an application to do whatever it is they want the user to do, you as the identity provider would try to enforce constraints there. If you wanted to only grant it permission to a single resource or for a limited amount of time, and how you want to serialize that in the access token is pretty open-ended. And lots of people do it in lots of different ways, and it's a fun space to be involved. But the spec itself doesn't give very, very detailed instructions for kind of like the business level concerns. It provides a funnel where you can direct the business level concerns.
Thank you for the talk. One question I have is, how does this scale up if you're dealing with like lots of ephemeral machine identities popping up? Especially, I can imagine right now that people are typing into an LLM and then it just does like a generative AI application. But when you have agents, they talk to other agents, and so they won't. It's unclear, would they be associated with the human identity? How do you think about the identity of agents, and that if they're ephemeral machine identities and you have like millions of them popping in and out of existence, how does this sort of scale with that? Are there any bottlenecks you have to be concerned about, especially with encryption, decryption of the JWT, authorization server signing it, and then somebody else trying to decrypt it with the public key of the authorization server?
Yeah.
Just wanted to understand that more.
Yeah. So in terms of new identities popping up all the time, one of the interesting things that MCP has kind of pushed forward is this idea of dynamic client registration. The idea that you don't need to go into a developer portal, request a client ID and client secret in order to access an API. You should be able to just access the API. And dynamic client registration has been around for a long time, but it hasn't really been one of the more popular OAuth specifications, because there's 40 of them. There's a lot of them. So it's kind of come into the spotlight in an interesting way. And that's how new clients are going to be able to pop in and out of existence. And then as for client identity, so OAuth also has parameters for that. There is the client credentials grant type. So what I talked about here was the auth code grant type, but there's others as well that define how different access tokens can be issued in different contexts. So there's some prior art in the spec. We'll see how it goes and how it maps to agents. I know that some working groups really want to make agents a standalone, a new type of identity in OAuth, and we'll see how that goes. I'm very interested to see how it turns out.